The dog found her first. Ezra Matane, 5th Duke of Ashtorl, stripped, exiled, erased, heard the mastiff's bark crack through the frozen air like a pistol shot. He dropped the splitting axe and moved. Not toward the sound, away from it. 3 years hiding in the northern marches had taught him that much. Sounds meant people, people meant recognition. Recognition meant the rope, but the bark shifted. High, frantic. Not the deep-chested alarm of a stranger approaching, the sharp, confused yelp of something discovered. He stopped at the wood line, turned back. The mastiff, Solomon, named in better days, was circling the stone well behind the cabin. Circling and whining. Ezra crossed the yard in 8 strides, hand dropping to the knife on his belt. What he saw at the base of the well stopped his hand. A child. Girl. Skeleton thin, curled against the stones, with her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around them so tightly the tendons in her wrists stood out like harp strings. Her lips were blue. Not cold blue. Starvation blue. The kind of color that meant the body had started eating itself days ago. She wasn't shivering. That was worse. Shivering meant the body was still fighting. Ezra looked at her for 4 seconds. He counted them. In those 4 seconds, he calculated. The nearest village was 11 miles south. No one traveled the North Ridge in winter unless they were lost or running. A dead child at his well meant questions. Questions meant visitors. Visitors meant the end of 3 years of silence. He should walk away. He didn't. He picked her up. She weighed nothing. A bundle of sticks wrapped in cloth that had once been a dress. He carried her inside, and Solomon followed, and the door closed against the wind. She didn't wake for 2 days. Ezra fed her broth through a soaked rag pressed to her lips. He kept the fire high. He did not do these things out of kindness. He did them because a dead child was a problem, and a living child could be sent away. That was the calculation. He held to it. On the second night, her eyes opened. Dark. Too large for her face. She looked at him from across the room where he sat cleaning a rabbit, and she spoke. "You're him." Ezra's knife stopped. The rabbit bled onto the table. "You're the Duke of Ashtorl," she said. Her voice was dry as paper tearing. He stood. The chair scraped back. Solomon lifted his heavy head from the hearth. "You're mistaken." His voice came out flat, controlled. The voice he'd used in council chambers. He hadn't heard it from his own mouth in 3 years, and it startled him. "No?" She pushed herself up on one elbow. The effort cost her visibly. Her arms shook, and sweat broke across her forehead despite the chill still living in her bones. "I know who you are. I was sent to find you." "Sent by whom?" "By no one living." He crossed the room in 3 steps. Stood over her. He was tall enough that the low ceiling forced a slight bow in his posture, and in the firelight the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw looked like a crack in stone. He did not soften his expression. "Explain." "Now," she told him. In fragments, between bouts of coughing that sounded like something inside her was coming apart. Her name was Naomi. She was 10, maybe 11. She wasn't certain. She had lived in the capital, in the lower warrens beneath the palace district, in the network of tunnels and forgotten cellars where the kingdom's orphans nested like rats in walls. "I worked in the fire rooms," she said, "carrying coal to the upper chambers, through the walls." The fire rooms. Ezra knew them. Every palace had them. The narrow passages behind the walls where servants moved unseen, feeding hearts from hidden alcoves. The architecture of invisibility. Children were preferred for the work because the passages were narrow, because children were quiet, because no one noticed children. 6 months ago, Naomi said, and stopped. Coughed, blood on her lip. She wiped it with the back of her hand like it meant nothing. 6 months ago, I was in the wall behind the king's study, feeding the evening fire. And I heard them. Heard who? Lord Abner and Chancellor Joab. The names hit Ezra like stones dropped into still water. Abner, the king's cousin, who had stood in the great hall and accused Ezra of treason, who had presented forged letters bearing Ezra's seal, letters allegedly offering military secrets to the eastern provinces in exchange for gold. Joab, the chancellor who had convened the tribunal, who had pronounced the sentence, who had stripped the Matane crest from the chamber walls while Ezra stood in chains. "What did you hear?" he said. Not a question, a command. Naomi looked at him. In her eyes, he saw something he did not expect. Not fear, assessment. She was measuring him. This starving child, this bundle of bones and rags, was deciding what to give him and what to withhold. "They were afraid," she said. "They talked about the sovereign codes." Ezra stopped breathing. The sovereign codes. 7 alphanumeric sequences known only to the reigning monarch that authenticated royal decrees. Without them, no law was binding, no sentence was final, no exile was legitimate. The codes changed with each monarch and were passed privately, sovereign to sovereign, never written, never shared with any advisor or chancellor. They were the skeleton key of the kingdom's legal architecture. No chancellor had access to the sovereign codes. No lord, no duke, no general. Only the king. But King Josiah had been dying. Everyone knew that. He had been dying slowly for 2 years, his mind fracturing, his body following. And in those final months, the machinery of power had shifted, quietly, invisibly, into the hands of those who stood closest. "Abner said the codes were compromised," Naomi continued. Her voice was steadier now. The broth had done its work, or perhaps it was the telling itself that fed her. "He said someone in the fire rooms had been listening. He said they needed to find a leak before the coronation of Prince Hezekiah, or everything they built would collapse." "What do you mean, everything they built?" "Your exile." She said it simply. "Your trial. The letters. All of it was sealed with codes that Lord Abner obtained from the king's chamber during his illness. He used them to authenticate the forged evidence. Chancellor Joab helped him draft the tribunal documents. They used the sovereign codes to make it all look legitimate, royally sanctioned, unquestionable." Ezra sat down, not in a chair, on the floor. Solomon patted over and pressed his heavy skull against Ezra's knee, and Ezra didn't move. 3 years. 3 years of exile, of silence, awaking every morning in this frozen cabin and remembering what he had been. Duke of Ashtoreth, commander of the northern garrison, member of the king's privy council, a man whose word had moved armies. All of it taken, not by truth, but by stolen codes pressed into forged seals by men who smiled while they did it. And a child in the walls had heard everything. "Why come to me?" His voice was quiet. "Dangerously so. Why not go to the prince, to the new king?" "I tried." Naomi's face didn't change, but her hands tightened on the blanket. "Prince Hezekiah was crowned 4 months ago. I tried to reach the court. Lord Abner's men found me first. They killed the other fire room children. Micah, Ruth, Joel, anyone who might have heard. I ran." She paused. "I've been running since autumn. 4 months. A child running alone through winter across the entire breadth of the kingdom to reach a man she'd never met. Because she'd heard his name spoken in fear by the men who had destroyed him." "How did you find me?" Abner said it. "In the wall. He told Job where you'd been sent. The North Ridge. The dead village beyond Kishon Pass. He laughed when he said it." Her eyes were steady. "He said you'd freeze before spring." Ezra looked at her. 10 years old. Maybe 11. She'd crossed 2 mountain passes in winter, with no food, no protection, carrying information that could reshape the kingdom's power structure. And she'd done it not because someone ordered her to, not because she understood the politics, but because she'd watched soldiers drag 3 children from the fire rooms and cut their throats in the coal cellar, and she'd decided that running was better than dying on her knees. He stood. "The codes," he said. "You heard Abner speak them." "Yes." "All 7? "All 7. And the documents he used them on, he listed them, your indictment, your trial order, the evidence authentication, the exile decree, the property seizure warrant, the Mathane name-stripping order, and," she hesitated for the first time, "the execution warrant." "There was no execution warrant. There is now. Signed 3 weeks ago. Abner convinced King Hezekiah that you've been communicating with Eastern insurgents from exile. The warrant is sealed with the old codes, King Josiah's codes, which Abner still has. It's already been dispatched. The fire cracked. Solomon growled low. How long? Ezra said. The riders left the capital 12 days ago. Fast horses, they'll reach the North Ridge within the week. 5 days. Maybe less, depending on the passes. Ezra moved. He pulled the trunk from beneath his cot and opened it. Inside, the clothes he'd been wearing when the soldiers had dumped him at the edge of the northern wilderness. A coat bearing the ghost of the Mathane crest where the embroidery had been torn away. Boots that had once been fine. A ring, his father's signet, that he'd hidden in his boot heel and that the soldiers had been too lazy to find. He put on the coat, pulled on the boots, slid the ring onto his finger. It fit the way it always had. When he turned back, Naomi was watching him with those 2 large eyes. Can you ride? He asked. I've never been on a horse. You'll learn today. He lifted her from the cot. She weighed more than she had 2 days ago, which meant almost nothing. He wrapped her in his second blanket, the wool one, and carried her outside. The cold hit them both like a wall. Solomon pushed through the door behind them and stood in the snow, ears forward. In the lean-to behind the cabin, Ezra's horse, Boaz, a raw-boned gray that had been a plow horse before Ezra had taken him from an abandoned farmstead, stamped and snorted at the sudden activity. Ezra saddled him with hands that were steady. He placed Naomi in front of the saddle and mounted behind her. She was rigid as wood against his chest. Where are we going? She asked. South. To Ramoth Gilead. There's a magistrate there, one of the old judiciary, a man named Tobias. If any court in this kingdom will hear a challenge to a sealed warrant, it's his. And if he won't listen, Ezra gathered the reins, look south where the tree line broke and the ridge descended into the long valley that led, eventually, to the kingdom's heart. Then we go to the capital, to the king himself, and you tell him every word you heard in that wall. He kicked Boaz forward. The horse lunged into the snow. Solomon ran alongside, chest deep in white, silent and relentless. Behind them, the cabin shrank to a dark point against the ridge. And then it was gone, and there was only the cold and the miles and the knowledge that a starving child carried the power to undo 3 years of engineered ruin. Ezra held her steady against the motion of the horse and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The codes existed, the proof existed, the child existed. Now it was just a matter of speed. They rode through the night. Naomi slept against his chest in fitful bursts, her body jerking awake at every stumble of the horse. Ezra didn't sleep. He navigated by stars and by memory. The ridge trail he'd walked 100 times in 3 years of exile, gathering wood, hunting, mapping every path in case the day came when he needed to run. He'd imagined that day as flight. Not this. Not a ride toward the thing that had broken him. By dawn, they descended below the snow line. The trees thickened. Pine gave way to birch, and the ground turned from white to brown to the black mud of early thaw. Boaz was laboring. Ezra pushed him anyway. There are riders behind us, Naomi said. Ezra didn't turn. How do you know? I can hear them. In the ground. Through the horse. He stopped Boaz, dismounted, pressed his ear to the frozen mud of the trail. She was right. A low, rhythmic vibration, multiple horses, moving fast, still distant, maybe 2 miles back, maybe 3, but closing. They found the cabin, he said. Not to her, to himself, working the calculation. 12 days from the capital, she'd said. He'd assumed the riders would follow the main road through Kishon Pass, which meant they'd reach his cabin in 5 days. But if they'd taken the eastern cutoff, harder terrain but shorter distance, they could have arrived last night, found the cabin empty, found his tracks in the snow. He mounted, kicked Boaz hard. Hold the mane, he told Naomi. Don't let go. She grabbed the coarse gray hair with both fists and said nothing. Solomon ran ahead now, breaking trail through the undergrowth, his massive body crashing through bracken and dead wood. The sound was too loud. Everything was too loud. But silence wasn't an option anymore. Only speed. They reached the river by mid-morning, the Kidron, shallow this time of year but wide and cold enough to kill. Ezra rode Boaz straight into it. The horse screamed and fought, but Ezra held him, and they crossed in water that reached Ezra's thighs and Naomi's waist. She gasped but didn't cry. On the far bank, Solomon shook himself once violently and kept running. "Ramoth Gilead," Ezra said. "How far?" he was asking himself. The answer was 10 miles, maybe 12, through forest and farmland, then the town itself, a judicial seat, small but legitimate, with a magistrate who'd served under the old legal charter, Tobias of Ramoth. Ezra had known him years ago, before. Whether Tobias would help a dead duke was another question. They smelled the town before they saw it. Wood smoke and livestock and the sour tang of a tannery. Ezra stopped at the tree line and studied the approach. A single road in, market stalls along the main street, a stone courthouse at the center, old, solid, the king's standard flying from its roof. "When we enter," he said to Naomi, "you say nothing unless I tell you to speak. And if they arrest you, smart child, too smart for 10. Then you run. Find Tobias yourself. Tell him what you told me. Every word, every code. I won't remember the way. Solomon will take you. Follow the dog." She looked down at the mastiff, who stood panting at the horse's shoulder, mud-caked, enormous. She nodded once. Ezra rode in. The stairs began immediately. A tall man on an exhausted horse, wearing a torn coat with the ghost of noble embroidery, carrying a half-dead child trailed by a war-bred mastiff. He didn't look at any of them. He rode straight to the courthouse, dismounted, and carried Naomi up the steps. The clerk at the door was a young man with ink-stained fingers and a face that hadn't yet learned to hide its thoughts. He looked at Ezra, looked at the ring on his finger, went white. "I need Magistrate Tobias," Ezra said. "The magistrate is in session, my lord. Sir, Now, the clerk ran. 3 minutes later, a door opened at the end of the hall, and Tobias of Ramoth stepped out. He was older than Ezra remembered, thinner. His beard had gone completely gray, and he walked with the careful precision of a man whose joints had turned against him. But his eyes were the same, sharp, measuring, missing nothing. He looked at Ezra. His face didn't change. "You're supposed to be dead," Tobias said. "Not yet. There's a warrant." "I know. That's why I'm here." Tobias looked at Naomi, bundled and dripping in Ezra's arms. Looked at Solomon, who had pushed through the courthouse door and now stood in the hallway growling at the clerk. "My chambers," Tobias said. "Now, before someone in this town sends a fast rider to the capital." The magistrate's chambers were small and cold. Law books lined the walls. A single window faced the courtyard. Tobias closed the door, locked it, and turned. "Talk." Ezra set Naomi in the chair by the desk. She sat with her hands in her lap, perfectly still, watching Tobias the way she'd watched Ezra, with that careful, calculating patience that belonged to someone much older. Ezra talked. He laid it out in order. The forged letters, the stolen codes, Abner's conspiracy with Chancellor Joab, the murdered children, the new execution warrant. He spoke without emotion. Facts only. The cold voice of a man who had spent 3 years burning everything soft out of himself. Tobias listened without interrupting. When Ezra finished, the magistrate sat down heavily and pressed his fingers to his temples. "The sovereign codes," he said. "You're telling me Abner obtained the sovereign codes from a dying king and used them to fabricate an entire judicial proceeding?" "Yes. And your proof is," he looked at Naomi, "this child. She heard them. She can recite the codes. She can identify which documents they were applied to. She's a fire-room orphan. No family, no standing, no legal identity. Any court in the kingdom will dismiss her testimony as, 'Not if the codes match.'" Tobias stopped. Ezra leaned forward. "Every sealed royal document in this kingdom carries an embedded code sequence in the wax. It's invisible to the eye, but readable under magistrate's glass, the refraction pattern in the seal. If the codes she recites match the codes embedded in my trial documents, that's not testimony. That's proof of access. proof that she heard what she says she heard, and proof that whoever applied those codes did so without royal authority, because no chancellor, no lord, and no court officer has legal access to the sovereign codes. Ever. Tobias looked at him for a long time. "You still think like a duke," he said. "I am a duke. The kingdom says otherwise. The kingdom was lied to, with its own seals." Tobias turned to Naomi. "Child, if I bring the trial documents from the archive, and I have copies because every judicial seat received them, can you tell me the code sequences?" Naomi straightened. Her dress was still wet. Her lips were still cracked. She was still closer to death than any child should be. But her voice, when she spoke, was clear as struck glass. "7 sequences," she said. "The first, applied to the indictment, is Aleph 7 Kof 3 Dalif 9 Shin. The second, wait," Tobias held up his hand. He crossed to the archive shelf, pulled down a sealed leather case, and opened it with a key from his chain. Inside, copies of the tribunal documents that had ended Ezra's life. The indictment, the trial order, the evidence authentication, all bearing the royal seal in dark red wax. He took out the magistrate's glass, a thick lens set in brass, old and scratched, and held it over the first seal. He tilted it, adjusted, squinted. His hand began to shake. "Continue," he said quietly. Naomi recited all 7. She did it without hesitation, without error, without inflection, like a child reciting a prayer she'd memorized in the dark. Which, Ezra realized, was exactly what it was. She'd carried these sequences in her head across 2 mountain passes, through winter, through starvation, through the knowledge that the men who owned them had murdered every other child who might have known them. She'd made them her prayer, her weapon, her reason to keep breathing. Tobias set down the glass. His hand was still shaking. "They match," he said. "God help us. They all match." The room was silent except for Solomon's breathing. "This changes nothing by itself," Tobias said, but his voice had shifted. The professional caution was still there, but beneath it, something else. The sound of a man who had spent years enforcing laws he suspected were built on rot, finally seeing the rot pulled into light. "I'm a regional magistrate. I can issue a stay on the execution warrant. Temporarily. I can authenticate the code discrepancy and submit it to the High Judiciary. But Abner controls the Chancellor's office. Joab controls the judiciary appointments. They'll bury it. Not if it goes to the king. Hezekiah is 22 years old and has held the throne for 4 months. Abner is his closest advisor. You think he'll listen to his father's codes." Ezra's voice cut like the edge of the axe he left behind. "Hezekiah received the new codes at his coronation. He knows what the old ones were. If Naomi recites the old codes to him directly, in open court, with witnesses, he'll know instantly that no one outside the royal chamber should possess them. He'll know that Abner's access proves theft. And he'll know that every document sealed with those codes is potentially fraudulent." He paused. "Including my exile, including my trial, including the name-stripping order that erased the House of Matain from the kingdom's records." Tobias stared at him, then at Naomi, then back. "You're asking me to convene an emergency appeal under the old charter and transmit it directly to the crown, bypassing the chancellor's office entirely?" "Yes." "That hasn't been done in 90 years. The mechanism still exists. If I'm wrong, if this fails, Abner will have me hanged beside you." "You're not wrong. The codes match. You've seen it yourself." The magistrate stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard where the king's standard snapped in the wind. Ezra watched him and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The evidence existed. The law existed. The only question was whether one old magistrate in a provincial courthouse had enough iron left in his spine to use them. Tobias turned. "I'll need her testimony in writing, sealed with my authority, and I'll need to send it by crown courier, not through the chancellor's relay. There are riders behind us. Abner's men. They'll be here within hours." Tobias moved. Faster than his age suggested. He pulled parchment from the shelf, ink, his judicial seal. He sat Naomi at the desk and began recording her testimony in the precise, formulaic language of the old charter. Naomi repeated everything. Calmly, completely, code by code, document by document, word by word. Ezra stood by the door with his knife drawn. Solomon stood beside him. The testimony took 40 minutes. Tobias sealed it. His own seal, his own authority, under the emergency provisions of the old charter that allowed any sitting magistrate to transmit directly to the sovereign in cases of suspected judicial corruption. He wrote the transmittal order, signed it, stamped it. Then he handed a second copy to Ezra. "If the courier doesn't make it," Tobias said, "you take this to the capital yourself." "And the girl?" Tobias looked at Naomi. She sat in a chair with her feet not touching the floor, her hands folded, her dark eyes steady. She had just dictated the destruction of the two most powerful men in the kingdom. She had done it with the flat precision of a child who had learned early that the world was a machine, and machines could be operated if you understood which levers to pull. "She stays under my protection," Tobias said. "Judicial custody. Old charter provision. Not even Abner can touch her without a direct royal countermand." Ezra looked at Naomi. She looked back. "Thank you," he said. He had not said those words in 3 years. They felt foreign, heavy. She shook her head. Small, definitive. "I didn't do it for you," she said. "Micah and Ruth and Joel are dead. Someone has to answer." The moral flip completed itself in that moment. Silent and total. She was not his instrument. He was hers. She had chosen him, found him, walked through winter to reach him, delivered the codes not as a gift but as a demand. The power had never moved from her to him. It had moved through her, aimed by her, fired by her at the men who had killed her family in the dark. Ezra understood. He inclined his head, the way a duke acknowledges a sovereign. Then he took the sealed documents, mounted Boaz, and rode south toward the capital with Solomon running beside him. Behind him, Naomi sat in the magistrate's chair and waited for the world to change. It took 11 days. The courier reached King Hezekiah first. The codes were verified within hours. Abner was arrested at court. Joab fled and was captured at the border. The tribunal documents were invalidated. Everyone, the house of Matain, was restored to the kingdom's records by royal decree, sealed with the new codes, unbreakable and clean. When Ezra rode through the gates of Ashtoreth for the first time in 3 years, the crest had already been rehung above the door. His people lined the road. He did not smile. He did not weep. He rode in silence, wearing his father's ring, and the only warmth he carried was the knowledge that somewhere in a cold courthouse in Ramoth Gilead, a girl who had survived on nothing was finally eating.